Hi, everybody, and welcome to another extended episode of Ask Dr. David. Today, we are going to be talking everything vaccine mandates, which I know is something that is hot in the news and hot in people's conversations because people have very strong feelings about this. So first of all, welcome, Dr. David.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for welcoming me to your devices today.
All right. Well, I want to say that today's conversation is going to be from a public health perspective. It's not a political conversation. We're not telling people what to do, what not to do. We're really just exploring and discussing some of the facts of what's going on out there and some of the reasons that may be leading people to come to different conclusions so that hopefully people can start to understand each other better when talking about these very heated issues. So the first thing I want to do, Dr. David, is talk about the federal vaccine mandate that was put into place last month and that is slowly coming into compliance. And if you could talk a little bit about what the guidelines are there and who it applies to.
Sure. So the federal mandate that was put forth was for federal employees and contractors, as well as for businesses that may do contracting with the government that take Medicare funds or Medicaid funds, as well as for large businesses over 100 people. Those were the people that were specifically targeted for this. And what was set forth was some minimum guidelines in terms of requiring a vaccine, or as what was said, or be doing testing on a once-a-week basis for COVID if the person is choosing not to vaccinate.
Okay, so, and I know that the people or the companies that fell under this had a certain amount of time to come into compliance. And as you said, there's two options. You either get vaccinated by the time that this comes into compliance, and the businesses have to make sure that there are programs in place to have that happen, or they have to have put into place some type of an option for those employees choosing not to get vaccinated to be tested on at least a weekly basis. So that's the general federal guidelines, everybody. Now, it's important to realize a couple of things. This only applies to those groups that Dr. David mentioned are falling under this guidelines. And then you also have things where it get a little bit more complicated and more nuanced, which have to do with smaller corporations or companies, local municipalities, school boards, et cetera. Now, we are also hearing a lot of mandate discussions in those areas. So tell me, David, what are your personal thoughts regarding vaccine mandates in general?
Yeah. So I am not in favor of a forced mandate where a person is being forced to do a medical procedure. I think it's important that it be balanced because also I fully recognize that employers have rights, corporations have rights as well as responsibilities because they need to make sure that their staff, as well as their clients and customers, are as protected as possible as well. So this becomes a very challenging balance for them to have to make because they're trying to do good by their individual employers and but at the same time they have a greater community, greater group that they're trying to also try to take care of or look after.
And so just from a legal perspective, I know that a lot of times we hear people quoting the First Amendment and I have the right to do this and the right to do that. I think it's important to know from a legal perspective that with some exceptions, those types of rights pertain to when the government is taking an action, right? So somebody could potentially make that argument in reference to a federal or a city or a local mandate. But if a company is choosing on its own to have some kind of a mandate in place, that does not invoke the First Amendment because that in and of itself is not the government making that choice if they don't fall under those government guidelines. So you said something really interesting, which is that we often talk about what rights do corporations have, what rights do employers have. And I think one of the things you mentioned that's very important is that employers may want to protect their customers. A lot of employers and companies were shut down during the pandemic, and many businesses went out of business. They were hit on very, very hard times. And there are some owners of companies who are seeing this as a way to sort of protect their business to be able to go forward. Okay. I do want to bring up one other thing, though, which is an important topic that's coming up in the news more, which has to do with certain labor laws. And that brings up an entire different conversation that's separate from personal rights. And I'm not a labor lawyer, so I'm not going to talk too deeply about it, but just to sort of address some of the other issues that we're seeing right now that are coming up have to do with contract law and unions, and certain unions such as law enforcement or airline pilots who are saying that the government or whoever the entity is that's putting this mandate on should have had to negotiate with the union in order to make something that's required. So I just want to put that out, that there are so many levels to this, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Now, I want to just generally also talk about exemptions, and for people that feel like for one reason or another that they shouldn't have to get a vaccine.
Yeah. So it's a complicated thing because there's this balance between personal individual rights versus what a corporation is choosing to do. Okay. And so that's kind of like when we were talking a moment ago against about, a person having a way out in terms of being able to testing, for instance. And, I could make an argument that even testing twice a week would be more appropriate because we know that 2 to 3 days is what it takes for a person to catch COVID before they start to have symptoms. So once a week may not even be enough to catch it. I've heard of some people doing twice a month, once a month, which to me, that's not even really accomplishing that much. But at the same time, there are people who may be saying, hey, why do I need to be vaccinated if I've had COVID already? I have documented antibodies against this. There's lots of research that's come out in England, that's come out in Israel, that has shown that people who have been vaccinated relative to people who have caught the disease wild, that people who have caught the disease wild may actually have even better immunity. We know that with the vaccine, the antibodies that are created are directed specifically against the spike protein. Whereas there are lots of proteins, about 20, that are on the natural virus that people can mount the antibodies to. There are receptor binding antibodies, there are neutralizing antibodies, nucleocapsid antibodies, and so it is felt that many people can develop even a more complete immunity if they had it in the past. Now, of course, this is different than somebody who is saying, I haven't had it before. And obviously we've talked many times about how there's two paths to immunity: people getting it through natural wild infection and people getting to the vaccine. And then, of course, there's a third group of people who haven't had either, and they're still susceptible and more likely at that point to have a more serious disease, more likely if they to catch it in the first place, more likely to spread it around because they're more likely to be symptomatic. So all of those things are important considerations as well.
Right. And I think it's interesting because it sort of begs this sort of philosophical conversation of, is there ever a time when the public health policy, the masses, what's good for the masses, should be overriding these personal healthcare decisions? And it's very tricky. And let's be honest, there is, in the middle of a global pandemic that has cost millions and millions of lives over throughout the world. And I think the number is up to almost 3/4 of a million here in the United States as of the time of this recording, that there is a compelling, which is a legal term, compelling government interest in putting forth rules and regulations in order to protect the economy, protect people. And so it's interesting because you have the individual who is saying, I have a strong immune system. Even if I had never had COVID, even if I don't want to get vaccinated, I have a strong immune system and I'm willing to roll the dice here. If I get sick, I'm probably going to not be that much more sick than if I just had the flu, and I'm okay with that. And I think the pushback that then happens there, or the counterpoint that happens there, is and this is potentially much more contagious than the flu, and also is spreading throughout certain communities at a very rapid rate and causing death to people, even those who are vaccinated and are trying to protect themselves as much as possible. So this is a very complicated ethical, moral conversation, but I'm just wondering if you want to say anything regarding where public health policy may at times need to override the rights of the individual.
Yeah, and that's a very important point because one of the things in the news this week was with Colin Powell. We know that he was fully vaccinated. He did not have a booster yet, but he also had multiple myeloma, which means he had an immunodeficiency. Obviously, the amount of protection that he would have received from the vaccine wasn't sufficient enough to stop him from having complications that took his life. So here was somebody who did what he thought was doing the right thing. He was obviously exposed to somebody who had the virus. Now, of course, we don't know what kind of protections he was doing in terms of physical distancing, masking, etc. But that's also a really important point. Now, to me, there is a different line being drawn about forcing a medical procedure on somebody versus, for instance, a person wearing a mask. That's a dress code type of issue. Nothing is being forced into their body, maybe with the exception of the breath that they had put out there if it was contained within it, but that was inside their body already, which is different than putting something into somebody where they don't wish to do so. And I realize that's tough because some people will ultimately make the choice of, well, I'm going to work there, or and take the vaccine, or I'm not going to work there and take the vaccine, or of course be tested if they're allowed. But we also know that some people aren't being even allowed to given that choice. They don't. Some companies are much more restrictive than what the federal mandate is. So, if just like at the very beginning, that when we were still trying to figure out COVID, we had a lockdown. That was pretty much a mandate, right? People were not just allowed to leave their houses at the time unless there was very specific reasons you were going to get food or you worked as a frontline critical care type of person. But otherwise, you couldn't. So those were mandates that we all had to follow. But for me, the difference is crossing the line when somebody is being forced to push something into their body, which again, nobody's truly being forced, because a person can always choose to not work at that place if that's what the only options that are put forth in front of them.
Right. And I think, one of the things that will unfold over time is who bears the responsibility of one paying for the tests, right? Like if an employer or even a customer at a restaurant or something like that, or a private club, where they have some kind of a vaccine mandate and they don't want to be vaccinated, is who's going to pay for that test? That's a conversation that's going on right now. And does insurance have any responsibility in those situations? Is a whole other ball of wax. And then we have the situation where some people are, like I mentioned before, they're in unions and they feel like they have a collective bargaining power that they want to make sure that they're not going to let that get whittled away through this. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why people choose to not get vaccinated, because I think this is a really important thing. I think that there is a lot of people who hold this position of, if somebody is not getting vaccinated, they are a quote unquote anti-vaxxer. And that is a very strong term that may apply to certain people who are just completely against vaccinations altogether. But really, there are many other groups of people, one of which you already mentioned, are people that may have already recovered from a symptomatic case of COVID and are getting their antibodies tested and have every right to believe that they have as strong immunity, if not more, than somebody who was vaccinated, who immunity may be waning at this point, right? What are some of the other circumstances where people may be making a choice to not get vaccinated at this time?
Yeah, so there are people who do have sincere religious beliefs, and I know that people are able to get religious exemptions in most states, not all states. So that's certainly something. Obviously, there are medical exemptions because some people may have had a negative reaction to that vaccine previously, or have some other medical condition. Although the number of reasons listed on the vaccine information sheet, the document that accompanies the vaccine, is rather limited as to what falls under the category of a medical exemption. There are people who may say, hey, listen, I have availability of getting monoclonal antibodies to me, so that if I start to get sick, I'm going to get tested, I'm going to get monoclonal antibodies and use it. Just like if the antiviral pill comes about, there will be people who say, hey, if there's a pill that I can take when I can get if I catch the disease, and that's going to significantly reduce my chance of hospitalization or death, I choose to do it that way. Now, of course, there's always counter arguments to that, such as, yes, but aren't you being potentially contagious to other people in the time leading up to that, or before you do seek care? Maybe you'll be passing it along to somebody else in your family. Yeah. So there's a counterpoint to anything that can be made, but that would be a reason. A person may say, hey, listen, I know I have great vitamin D and zinc levels. There are so many studies that have shown that people who have very optimalized vitamin D and zinc levels, and by that I mean people who are testing and making sure that their levels are in the middle part of range, not just because they're taking it. But the research has shown that people who do that are significantly less likely to be hospitalized or to die because their levels are good. So I mean, that's one of the things that people ask me. They said, you've helped keep my family healthy all of these years, and when everybody else is catching the flu or everybody else is catching rotavirus, my kid is not the one who's getting it. My family doesn't get it. We've proven that our immune systems are able to handle it because of what we're doing. We eat healthy. We don't put sugars into our bodies, and artificial things into our body in general. So when some people say I don't put these things into my body, things that are foreign, I mean, I do have patients who will put nothing foreign into their bodies, who do not put any ingredient to their body that they cannot pronounce, nothing processed. And so, for me, that's a person who would have a different type of belief than somebody who decides that all of a sudden this is the one that they're having a religious, for instance, a religious, if they're claiming it as such, against that. Because but then again, there are people who have done every other vaccine and who are not necessarily taking that type of holistic lifestyle. That too. So again, my obviously we'll talk a little bit about my take home message here is, but those are certainly the things that I'm hearing on a regular basis for people who have continued to have vaccine hesitancy.
Right. And it's important. It's an important conversation. I think, like I said, is that when, earlier, when we're in the middle of a global pandemic, it's you have the side of the public health experts that are saying, okay, our job is to treat the country as a patient and to say what is the best thing for the country, right? And for the countrymen, women, so to speak. And that doesn't always align with the individual. That's just a reality that we kind of deal with. And we're not such a sophisticated, for as sophisticated as our technology is, and we are as humans, we have not yet reached that level of sophistication where we're able to sort of do these individual 350 million people living in this country, for example, individual assessments right on the spot every time you walk into a public library, for example, as to whether or not what your antibodies are at that level. So, there's just some, it's very complicated. I do want to also say a couple other things, which is that there are also communities, specifically immigrant communities, communities of color, people in certain economic brackets that have been taken advantage of historically by our government and that have a very deep-seated mistrust of being told that they are going to have to get something put into their body. And that is legitimate concerns that are also being addressed. And then there are also people who are subject to disinformation. So address that a little bit, because I think when we're talking about individual beliefs and individual rights and how those weigh against society's needs, how do you factor in the fact that there is genuinely non-scientific misinformation that is being circulated at this time?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can certainly say how I handle that individually when I'm counseling people when they're asking these questions is I think it's important to know, well, what information are you hearing? What information is it that you've come across that has brought around some of your decisions or where you're at this point? Okay. I mean, we're still hearing about this concept of shedding of the vaccine somehow, where, pardon me, where the school that was down in Miami who was previously telling kids don't hug your parents if your parents were vaccinated because it may shed to you, and we're telling teachers that they weren't really welcomed at the school as a teacher if they were vaccinated. Now what are they doing? They're telling the families that if your kid is vaccinated, that you have to keep your kid out of school for 30 days after each dose that they get. So this is still, and there's absolutely no information there's nothing that shows that anything is being shed. There is no virus. You don't catch the virus from it. What is being shed and something that's being put into your arm and that's not being circulated through your body, let alone to getting into across your lungs, the other way being breathed out. Some of these things just do not make sense. I still hear people talking about concerns of the government or Bill Gates microchipping in the vaccine so that way and so that they can track us. So that is, those are different types of things that I believe are debunkable. But then there are other people who come up with some of the things that we talked about. So I think just really also sharing with them what I've learned. People have certainly also learned about me that I try to take this as a matter of factual kind of way. I'm not a forced person. I don't sit there and degrade people. I don't say you shouldn't poke people in the face with this. I want to share the information. And one of the things that I've learned over time doing this types of counseling is that there has been a fair number of patients of mine who, once we went through this, where I asked them, what's the potential benefit versus risk of catching COVID? What's the potential versus the potential risk of getting the vaccine? Make that list, discuss it. Let's come back to that if it's not an obvious thing to you. But I've also found that giving people the latitude and the information to and encouraging them to look elsewhere beyond their social media feeds, that they're making different types of decisions in the long run. And let's face it, we know the vaccines are not perfect, no doubt. They don't work all the time. We're having breakthroughs. We know that there are vaccine reactions that are happening. Okay. And again, we know how potentially severe the disease, the virus itself is. And not even if it's a fatal type of condition, but with the long hauler and everything else. So I really want people to really weigh all of that stuff out when they're making their own decision.
Okay. And, I also want to say that one of the concerns that, just to put out there that we haven't talked about, is that some of the public health experts are putting out in terms of their concern of people who are not vaccinated or choosing not to get vaccinated and did not have the virus, is that, especially in communities where that's very prominent, that it leaves some room for the virus to actually mutate and cause variants and grow, which is what we saw with Delta, right? Like we kind of got spanked by that as a society. I think a lot of people weren't expecting that to come about so quickly. So that's sort of another variable I'm just sort of throwing into the mix here as people make these individual decisions and try to understand why it is that communities and government and civic leaders and business leaders are sort of trying to weigh all of these things at once. So let's wrap up by me asking you this. You've talked very openly both about your own choices related to vaccination for yourself and your family. In general, where are you sitting now with the COVID vaccination program in terms of general guidance if you were talking to the United States as your patient?
Yeah. Well, kind of as we had just said, it is my belief that if for most people out there who objectively weigh the pro versus con of catching the disease versus the pro versus con of taking the vaccine, that things do lead pretty strongly into the benefit of being vaccinated versus the benefit, if you can say so, of catching COVID. I guess there is benefit. There's natural immunity. To me, in my opinion, it weighs in favor of being vaccinated. I'm also one who believes in choice. And so I'm happy, that we are in a society that people, even if it's a minority position, that they still have the choice to make these types of decisions because they think it is our bodies and it's our choice, our health, our choice. That's obviously the name of our other show. But I just strongly feel that that's part of, America was based upon freedom and liberty. I realize that even those words have become politically charged these days. I mean, how sad is that what the foundation of our country is based on? When people now, so often when people talk about freedom and choice and liberty, that's, in certain circles, it's like those are almost considered negative terms. And like, how can those be negative terms? That's what our entire nation was built upon that. But what else are we missing out on is respect of others. Right? On both sides of this argument, there is so little respect. The discourse is terrible. The name calling, it's truly terrible and disgusting what we're hearing out there. And I really would just encourage people, to have open types of dialogues, learn something. Hopefully with watching our shows that you're learning something that may give you a different point of view in either direction. But something that you may not. And to me, that's what education is about. And that's what it's all about when you're trying to make the best decision. Because at the end of the day, no matter who we are, nobody's sitting around and saying, I'm going to make a bad decision for myself. Everybody truly believes that they're making the best decision for themselves. Right. And we know that almost half of the people will disagree with one person's decision and versus the other. So, it would be great if we could take the temperature down, de-steam this whole situation and just realize people are going to come around to their decisions. Obviously, the overwhelming majority of people in America have chosen to take a vaccine. 75% now of people have had at least one dose of the vaccine who are eligible. So that's a very big number. And you know what? More importantly, isn't that close to the number that we were told that herd immunity was going to come about? And that's not even taking into account herd immunity from the virus, which is natural immunity.
Right.
Why are we seeing such a significant decline now in the virus? Is because there are so many more people who have immunity contributing to herd immunity. Many more people, whether it's because of the mandates or because they were scared once they saw that what Delta was going to do, have chosen to get the vaccine. And of course, just because of the spike that we've been through, and of course, in other parts of the country, the new cases are still very high. Fortunately, in Florida, we've seen a massive reduction in the number of cases. Now we're not quite back to where we were in June, but we're close. But that's because a lot more people have had the virus also. So herd immunity is upon us. One of the other things that I'm hopeful for, because one thing we have not heard about is we haven't really been hearing about other variants of concern for a while, right? We knew even before Delta hit our shores, we knew that that's what took over India and what happened there. We know that that moved on to England, and that's what happened there. So we knew about this variant coming for a while, just like at the very beginning in March of 2020. When we started to see, those cases come, even though we heard about it happening in Asia and otherwhere, and then on a cruise ship, right? So we knew that these things were coming. So I'm hopeful that because of the level of herd immunity that we have, that we're not going to have that. Now, of course, part of the challenge is that in other parts of the world, there are many, many people who are not immune. And so will a variant arise outside of the country that it can be brought in? That is a concern that I have. We cannot say that can't happen.
And especially now that we are opening borders again, and that creates other kinds of things. I want to wrap up by just saying, I know, because I want to name this, I know that in your close circle, in your community, that you recently lost a close friend to COVID. And I'm wondering if you can just tell me a little bit about that situation, because I think it's important for people to realize that, like, we're all being affected by this in one way or another. We're trying to have these conversations, as objectively as possible, and it is hitting close to home for a lot of people.
Yeah. Within the last month, I was fortunate, our family was fortunate, we did not know anybody who lost their life or who was very significantly damaged from COVID. Within a week's period of time, one of my best friend's father had a breakthrough infection. He unfortunately did have a lot of health complications going into. He was a very high risk of person to getting a severe, and his kidneys shut down, his organs shut down, and he passed within a week of catching it. And another family friend in our school community, my daughter's, one of her closest friends in school, her mother did not. Did catch the virus. My understanding is that she was not vaccinated, and her kids got sick. They did fine with it, but she ended up being hospitalized. She was low oxygen. Within a relatively short period of time, she was the regular oxygen. She was put on a heart-lung machine. It's called an ECMO machine, and she was actually stable on that for a while. And then her organs shut down, and she passed. And she left behind two children in elementary school, a child in middle school, and a child in high school. And I mean, this was obviously very devastating to our community on both ends for both of the reasons that people have concerns about this virus. And when it hits home, when it's somebody that when it's somebody that you've hung out with, when it's somebody that's part of the community, part of your extended family, I will tell you, it hit me really, really hard, and those are things that scar us, when you lose somebody like that, let alone what it must be for the family members themselves. I can't even imagine.
Right. Yeah. And so, not to leave on like a down note, but just to sort of bring our own selves into this, right? I think it's something that people really appreciate about you and about me. Transparency and sort of being willing to drop into the heart a little bit and share a little bit personally how these things affect us. So there's going to be much more that we're going to be talking about over the coming years, really, probably related to this. We're going to be tackling lots of other subjects that are hot in the news right now that relate to choice. So those will be coming at you soon. In the meantime, we ask that you please subscribe to our YouTube channel and join us on social media. Please leave us comments below. We really appreciate hearing from people. We also really want to know what questions are you having that we haven't answered yet that you'd like to hear Dr. David chime in on. So we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot, Dr. David.
Absolutely. Have a great day, everyone.